What's up, everybody? We are still in Patagonia, Torres de Paine behind me, the two spires, one of the most unbelievable mountains I've ever seen in my life. We are at this cool waterfall area called Salto Grande, and with a little bit of a hike down, I found this area where all of the rocks and the rapids are shown and the entire mountain chain. So it's a little bit of a walk down, not too difficult with these rocks. They're actually really grippy and jagged, so they stick you right to the bottom of your feet so you don't feel like you're going to fall. But my instinct in these types of situations is to always get as close to the edge or close to the water as possible, not just for dramatic effect, but usually I want the water washing through the composition of my photograph. So in this case, it's a small area to work with. It's a little bit jagged. I have to think about, one, finding a good composition, two, finding a way where I'm not going to get too much water spray, and three, finding an area that's sheltered from this incredible, insane amount of wind that we have too. The other thing is, with all these jagged rocks, I have to find a good place that I can set up my tripod to avoid it being knocked down by this wind. So it has to be really secure, safe, and of course, a really nice composition. Just like the other locations here, this is my first time here, and again, my instinct is to go right to the water. Let's go ahead and scout out a few compositions so that I can get set up to get ready to get the shot. So the first thing I'm going to do is carefully walk all the way down to the water. And I have these really cool rocks here, rapids, and this crazy mountain peak. I have my Fujifilm GFX 50S, the 23mm, which again is an 18mm equivalent in full frame format. And I already tested, when I look through this camera, I can get the entire ridge from the left side all the way to the right side. 4x3 composition gives me a little bit more on the top and the bottom. So I can kind of do this. I'll go ahead and take a few steps back, actually. Let's go back just a little bit. Secure myself. We'll do one reference photo here. I don't feel like my camera's wide enough to really get this to work. I want to go back a little bit further, see if I can get this entire rock in the foreground and the entire set of the mountain. Overall, I like the composition though. I love the big rock in the foreground, and the mountains are just insane. So let's move around a little bit, see if we can find a better position. And again, it's really windy. Actually, down here sheltered, up there is about 40 to 50 mile an hour wind. Here we have 20 to 25 mile an hour gusts. So I have to consider that too when I'm setting up. Well, let's try here. What I want to do is just move this so I have the mountains, sky, and try not to get blown over in the process. All right, so this I'm starting to really like. I have the entirety of this rock in the water. I get a little bit of these rocks in the foreground, the ones that I'm standing on, but I get the rapids, I get both sides of these green hills, and the entirety of the mountain. It's actually pretty cool. I really like this spot. Now I'm wondering though if this rock is too dominant in the foreground. So in order to change that, it looks like I can kind of move around to this other area, which is relatively safe as well. So I'm going to carefully get over to this next spot, try again. This shot looks good to me too. It actually gives a little bit more dominance on the rapids. Mountains are about the same, but the rock kind of goes away. It kind of moves off to the right. Right now I kind of liked it with it in the foreground. One of the things about going all the way down to the bottom here is as I get lower and lower and lower, these hills are really close. They're obscuring the mountain. So right now I can still see the mountains above these hills, but I have a feeling that even though my instinct is to go as close to the water edge, and in this case as close to danger as possible, it may be better to get a little higher up. Now I'm thinking I may still be able to have these rocks in the foreground, and I may be able to lower these hills and pull those amazing mountains up a little bit higher in the composition. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to stand up here, brace myself against the wind. It's ridiculous. A good friend of mine told me before I was coming here, he's been coming here for 30 years. First thing he said, Patagonia, beautiful and windy. Now I believe him. So here, let's go ahead and take this shot. Still get the rocks in the foreground, spreads out the landscape, doesn't compress it quite as much, which is okay. And what's cool is I still have enough of the sky, the entirety of the mountains, and as we can see, if we take a look at this frame, the most recent one that I shot, as opposed to one of the earlier frames, pay attention to the mountains on the left and the right. You actually see that raising our altitude a little bit has lowered the hill and raised the mountains from behind the hill. So I like this. I wouldn't want to go up any higher, I don't think, because I still want to feel like I'm close to the water. But this is a good compromise. And honestly, with the wind, I'll set my camera up really low. It should be pretty secure. And most importantly, I think I'll be safer up here as well. All right, so here's where I was standing. It's kind of jagged here. I remember what I was saying, when I get down really low, it changes those mountains. But I feel like wind like this means that I should put my tripod pretty low. So I don't think I'm going to extend it all the way. Usually I'd say too, if the wind's blowing this way, I'd put one of the legs back so that the wind kind of pushes against that. You don't want to have the wind blowing against the two legs like this. You want to have one to support it. But honestly, the wind keeps gusting from every direction. So honestly, there's no real way that I can brace against it. The only thing I can do is make sure that this is set up as secure as possible. So let's try first. There's nothing here. This is all kind of crusty rock. I think it's going to break right away, but this and this looks really secure. Now this rock is really quite good, but I want to find these little areas where it'll lock right in. Like that's not that great over there. It's like tripod Tetris. Trying to find the most secure spot. What I'll also do in this situation, and usually as long as it's close, it's okay, but I'm actually going to use the level on the top. I want to make sure it's as stable as possible. Just a few more adjustments here. I don't know if you guys can see that through the view, but that's fairly close, fairly level. I can actually go down a little bit more. It's a little tricky. You have to look straight down on it, but it's pretty good. I'll actually just kind of do this a little bit. I need this to be really stable for a couple reasons. One, I don't want this thing to blow away. I don't want to blow away. Two, we have water. We have a moving element, so I'm going to need to do some sort of longer exposure. And we've learned in previous lessons of photographing the world that when it comes to waterfalls, especially little rapids and stuff like this, we only need a second, sometimes even a half a second will do the trick. Now, it's super windy. I don't have any screw-on filters. I use square neutral density filters because I'm able to take my filter holder and with a series of adapter rings, put it on different lenses. But the problem is that filter holder is this big square object that's sitting on the front of my lens. Right now, this thing is vibrating when I'm touching it from the wind. If I put a giant filter on the front of my camera, I can't guarantee it's going to be there when I want to use it. So what I'm going to try to do is, as the light gets a little bit softer, I have the ability on my GFX 50S of going up to f36, which is really nice. So I get an extra stop. So what I'm going to do is force a long exposure in camera. When I say long exposure, maybe a half a second to 1 second. So in between exposures, if we're going to do any blending, I'm using this, making sure it's completely level and as stable as possible, because with all this wind, I don't want it to shift, vibrate, or move in between any of the exposures. So I have a lot of stuff in my bag right now. Wouldn't recommend hiking with all this stuff, but when you're teaching lessons or photographing the world, you never know exactly what you're going to need. But basically, just to show you, I do have my filters. They're going to be useless in this situation. So right now I'm just going to take the camera on the tripod. In my pocket, I just have a little packable, collapsible microfiber cloth. So I'm just going to keep this in my pocket out so that I can wipe down the front of the camera. This feels pretty solid to me. Kind of just putting my hands on it. I feel it vibrating a little bit, but 18 millimeter is pretty wide. Even with slight vibration, it should still be okay. I definitely would not attempt any telephoto shots at the moment with slow shutter speeds because this wind is just too out of control. So let's go ahead and frame everything up. Take a look at this. It looks pretty good, but I feel like I need to move my camera down, rotate it down a little bit because the water level's changing on that rock, and I want to make sure that there's water in my frame, between the bottom of the frame and the rock. I don't want to feel like that rock is being cut off. Now the issue I'm having is that when I was standing here, I was standing where the tripod was, but I was up quite a bit taller. So now that I've gone a little bit lower, my composition's a little bit different. So I'm just going to make some small adjustments until I feel I'm at my final sort of settled place where I want to have this shot. Just move this a little bit, slight adjustment. All right, take a look at this. Looks exactly the same, right? Yeah, it pretty much is. I moved it, honestly, just a tiny little bit down and to the left. But to be honest, I just want to make sure that I have enough water there. Right now, the sky looks a little bit dull. It could change, it could get better, it could get worse. But right now, I'm going to go with this composition. So while I have my reference frame in this shot, let's go ahead and take a look at the settings. My settings at f8 ISO 100, and 100 is the lowest I can go with the GFX 50S. I'm getting a shutter speed of 50. So a shutter speed of 50. So right now, that's not going to soften the water. Let's go ahead and ramp this up to f32, and now I'm getting a shutter speed of 1/3.2. So if I take that shot really quick, you can see the one slower shutter and the faster shutter. Not a whole lot of difference, but you can start to see that the water is getting a little bit softer. So I have a feeling that as the light starts to fall off, I should be able to get a half-second exposure here in camera. My biggest concern at the moment is the wind and the weather. So as long as that keeps up, stays good, and at least dramatic, we're gonna have a good shot. Should be able to work out the discrepancies in exposure as the light starts to fall off a little bit more. It's good to point out that anytime you can use a neutral density filter, a really high quality one, I use the Format High-Tech Firecrest. Those are glass filters. Anytime I can use one of those, I'll definitely use it because the clarity of the glass does not hurt your final result at all. Whereas once you leave the comfort of f8, f11, getting into 16, 22, and of course 32, you end up with diffraction. So we like to say that the lens starts to get extremely sharp right around f8, but then as you start to go more and more towards the f22 direction, you get diffraction, which actually eats up the sharpness of the frame. So even though technically the aperture gets smaller, it lets less light in, it's technically supposed to be sharper, but because of diffraction, it gets softer. So you actually eat up a lot of the detail in the background and the trees and everything like that. But since we can go ahead and blend multiple elements together, in this case, I can take the f8 exposure for everything, then in Photoshop, bring in the f32 exposure just for the water. Again, if I would have had a screw-on filter, I believe this is a 82 millimeter thread, I could have just used the screw-on filter. So that's always something else to consider. Square filters are amazing because you can change them on each lens just with an adapter. But in windy situations like this, they can be a problem because they will make the camera move quite a bit. And it's a big surface to collect the water. So I'm gonna go ahead and tweak some of the settings in the camera here, make sure myself and the camera doesn't get blown completely out of frame. Clean up the front, put the lens cap on once I get everything ready to go. And as soon as the light starts to fall off, I have a good feeling about the color behind these mountains tonight. As soon as the sun starts to get closer to setting, I'll check back with you guys and we'll work through the rest of the shot. Beginning to approach sunset. Still have a little bit of time, but I can already see the clouds. I hope it stays like this. I hope they stay broken. They're really nice and they have potential to light up, but it's also really bright. We're dealing with pretty much a backlit situation, which is bad for most landscapes, but when you have water, the water can pick up the highlights of the sky. So depending on what happens with the sky, if that turns more like of a golden color or red color, we could get really lucky that we have that color bounced onto the water. Since it's so bright, I'm using 3 exposure brackets, but what I've done is I've EV shifted down -1. So with 3 exposure brackets enabled, with an EV shift of -1, that means I get a -2, a -1, and a 0. With the Fujifilm GFX 50S, you can recover up to 4 stops of dynamic range in the shadows, which is incredible. You can recover highlights fairly well, but in this type of situation where the clouds are really, really, really bright, you have to be careful that even though the histogram may show that everything is fine and nothing's blown out, when you get into post-processing, you notice that a lot of the detail is missing. The other thing that's really difficult here is this thing will blow away if I don't hold on to it if we get a wind gust. So everything that I'm doing here, changing between settings, I have one hand on the tripod holding it down, not just so it doesn't blow away, but also so it doesn't move in between my settings. So I'm basically shooting. I have in the Q mode here, I set it to a 2-second delay. So when I'm shooting here, I can click the shutter, hold the tripod, 2 seconds will go by, then it'll go through my exposure brackets. Then I can change it to f32, press it one more time, hold on for dear life, and it'll go through all of them. Now right now at f32, I'm getting a longer exposure because it is getting darker out. Once that sun sets, we should be able to get a half a second. We should be able to get some really nice, smooth flowing water. I'm shooting in aperture priority mode. Now I could go to full manual, which means that I'd have to change these settings all the time. But in this kind of dynamic lighting environment, with the metering of the cameras being so good these days, I can trust it. So as that light starts to change, my metering in the camera will continue to change, and in aperture priority mode, it will automatically set my shutter speed for me. If I was in full manual mode, I'd have to tweak too many settings on this camera, especially with these turbulent situations. I have water, I have wind, I have so many things to worry about. Aperture priority mode just makes it much easier to work with as that light starts to change. Since this shot is going to require me bouncing between f8 and f32 on a regular basis, basically every time I shoot, f8, then f32. Last thing I want to worry about is also changing the settings in manual mode. So throughout this tutorial, you guys are going to see me using aperture priority mode quite often because it makes it one less thing that I have to worry about. Another cool thing to point out is since I decided to come up here to the top of the rock, I'm shooting at the equivalent of 18 millimeter. I did some tests, some focus on the foreground rock here and the background, and the discrepancy isn't that much. In other words, I don't need to focus stack. So I can basically focus this on any of those elements in the background, the green hill or the mountains, to focus right around infinite or infinite, and everything's perfectly in focus. So thankfully I don't have to focus stack as well as shoot between f8 and f32. When we got here, the weather was pretty clear. We could see the mountains. We went up top. It was super windy. We came down here, less windy. I almost just got blown over by the wind. And in the last, I don't know, we've been here about 45 minutes to an hour. The weather has changed completely. The mountains have gone behind clouds, come out from clouds. There's been some rain. There's these beautiful clouds. Now the right side looks perfect. It seems like every 5 minutes, the weather completely changes. This whole scene changes. It's hard to describe, actually. I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen, even in Iceland, places like that, I've never seen the weather change so rapidly like it does here in Patagonia. Well, the sun's just about to set, and unfortunately, thick clouds are about to obscure the mountains, or at least I think that's going to happen. There's still about 20 minutes, 25 minutes of good light, or the potential of good light, but at this point, I think the clouds are going to disappear. I'm going to stay here and shoot through it anyway, but I have a feeling that about 20 minutes ago, when we could still see the tops of the clouds, they started to light up a little bit yellow. That may have been the best opportunity or the best version of this shot. So it wasn't exactly a sunset. It ended up being kind of a golden hour, but the clouds still look nice. Now, even though the clouds are starting to obscure the mountains, I'm still going to wait it out because anything can happen here. We've seen strong gusts of wind, no wind, clear sky, dappled clouds, and now just thick black clouds. So in another 10 minutes, could be nice again. So I'm going to go ahead and keep using the same technique. I've had my hands firmly on this camera because the wind's been out of control, holding everything down on the tripod. I've been shooting the brackets at f8, and then I was going to f32. But the light fell off so much that I thought the exposures were too long. And I'll show you guys in post-processing where sometimes when you have an exposure that's maybe 1 to 2 seconds, all of this whitewash turns white. So you want to make sure that the exposure is long enough to soften the tendrils of water out, but not so long that everything just turns white. So instead of f32, I started using f22 to give myself an extra stop, so it wasn't quite as long. And again, we'll take a look at that all in post-processing. And for now, I'm going to stay here a little bit longer, see what this crazy weather does, and hopefully the light will improve. The sun is officially set, and I wish I could say that the colors were awesome, the sky lit up, and it was amazing, but to be honest, it got really flat, and the mountains got covered up with gray clouds. So around the area that we were shooting, of course, the opposite direction we were looking, clouds turned pretty nice. But to be fair, 35, 40 minutes ago, before those black clouds came in, everything looked pretty good. We had nice puffy clouds, some texture, and they lit up to a nice yellow color. Not only that, it reflected in the water. So I think we have a really nice shot during gold hour, but unfortunately the sunset just kind of dudded out. So this is a really good example where it's nice to be here early to set up, but it's also nice to be here early just in case the weather doesn't turn out. In fact, 40 minutes ago when the clouds were looking pretty nice, there were no dark clouds on the horizon. In fact, I thought it was going to get completely clear, which is another problem. I had no idea that it was going to turn all black like this. It actually looks like it's going to rain now. So being here early, having everything set up, and already shooting before the sunset was the best possible scenario because I ended up being able to get a really nice shot. Since I've been here for a while, I've shot a lot too, so we're going to have to take a look at everything, find that frame with the best clouds, the best light, and then match it with the F32 longer exposures as well, bring it all in, and edit it in post-processing. Hello and welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. Today we're going to work on the images that I captured at Salto Grande, that incredible Patagonian waterfall, and one of the windiest places I think I've ever been. It's definitely a little humbling and a tad dangerous. I have a feeling that the behind the scenes is going to show a little bit more of the intense winds that we actually dealt with. But let's go ahead and get started and take a look inside of Lightroom. So inside of Lightroom, I've actually just selected 2 images for us to work with today, and actually that's an exposure here. I know it looks a little bit blown out. We're going to address that. That's the baseline exposure here at f8, and then I have another exposure here at f22. That's a half-second exposure, and we can see that difference of the soft water to the frozen in time water, but a half second gives me all those nice little tendrils of waterfall and everything that we're going to need. So we're basically going to correct these, do the heavy lifting, a lot of more aggressive color correction here inside of Lightroom, bring these both into Photoshop and then blend them together so we can take advantage of using the soft water on top of the f8 exposure. I'll explain this a little bit more when we get into Photoshop and I'll show you the examples, but essentially everything that I shot at f8 is going to be much sharper than f22 because of diffraction. So we'll zoom in and take a look at the difference. But here at the start, these two are going to work really well. We're going to put together a really nice image at the end. The other thing is I shot exposure brackets, so this is the middle bracket. So if it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 exposure brackets, this is bracket number 3. It's right in the middle, and if you look at the histogram, it looks like we have everything intact. Highlights are kind of getting close to that edge here. You can see how much blue we have, and you can see how much blue is in the sky. It looks like we can't recover the sky, but this is shot on the Fujifilm GFX 50S, which is incredible when you want to recover dynamic range. We've kind of looked at that recovering in the shadow areas so far, so I wanted to take it a little bit further and recover some of the highlights in this image. And the heavy lifting is going to be the color correction and getting all of the color separation, the different tones, the fall colors and everything, so I wanted to make the blending process as simple as possible. Let's start by exporting this, and I'll export with previous, and you guys know that's going to be a 16-bit PSD Pro photo, and it's going to open it up in Photoshop as well. I'm going to go ahead and name this Original Raw. In Lightroom, first let's profile this. I want to use Adobe Landscape, and as you see, as I change it from Adobe Color to Adobe Landscape, it starts to really pop those colors. Well, that's great, because I want this to be a really dynamically colorful and contrasty scene. I'm just going to do that to both of these images really quick, and we'll see that they match, and all those colors are starting to pop. The other thing I'm going to need to do, of course, is scroll down here and turn off the sharpening. We're not doing a lot of blending here, but it's good to just take care of it. There are only 2 images, so I'm going to go ahead and do it manually for each one, and we'll scroll back up and start taking care of some of the color corrections. First thing, let's warm it up. It's pretty close, but let's say 80 to 100 should make it a little bit warmer. Let's go ahead and bring the exposure up to compensate for the shadows, about half a stop, so 0.5. Also bring in some vibrance just to pop those colors a little bit. Next, let's go ahead and adjust the exposure for the sky. I'm going to get this in the right place first, somewhere right around there. Let's go ahead and reset this, but we're actually going to bring the exposure down a full stop, so -1. Let's continue, drop the highlights a little bit, try -25. Let's also go to the whites. Let's pull that down, negative 25 as well. And let's compensate. Let's pull the shadows up, positive 25. Let's go ahead and warm up that sky, make it look like it's closer to sunset, and we'll tint it a little bit too. Next step, just a little bit of dehaze to add that sky drama. Let's adjust this a little bit. I'm getting sort of that negative effect on the mountains, so let's see if the range mask does the trick. Let's pick luminance, and let's see if I can get rid of those mountains. Yeah, there we go. Just able to do it right around 40. So 40 over 100 looks pretty good. Now that's going to mitigate the effect on the mountains a little bit. It does also soften the effect overall in the sky, but it still looks pretty good. And you can see if I turn that off, I'm going to do that again. Take a look at the mountain range, the green part on the left before the mountain. As I start to move this up, you can see that it's removing that effect. So I think it was right around 30 to 40. Let's go ahead and put it around 30. That's good. Just soften it up just a little bit so that we can control this. Let's double down on our sky here and do some more correction. That is way too much. Let's go ahead and zero all that out. That actually was doubling down on everything. All I really want to do here with the top of the sky is pull the temperature down just a little bit so we can cool that down and get that blue back. That looks pretty good. Pull this down just a little bit more. And I want to increase the dehaze. So let's say 10. That looks pretty good. So now I'm bringing that dramatic blue back to the top of the sky. Now, let's see if we can warm up this area of the sky and the mountains. I want this to be fairly wide selection ellipse into this area of the mountains. And I'll just go ahead and scale this down just a little bit more. Perfect. We'll go ahead and get rid of that effect. We'll warm it up a little bit. That's starting to look pretty nice. I think 15 looks pretty good. Let's try 10, just to give it a little bit more magenta. And you know what? Let's add a little bit more dehaze. Give it a little bit of drama, and also darken up those mountains back there. Well, let's take a look. If there's anything else left that we want to do, everything looks pretty good. Histogram looks balanced. I can see almost everything in the sky. It's a little bit blown out. We'll address that with another technique inside of Photoshop. Now we need to match these settings. So what I'll do is I'll right-click this one. And what I've been using is develop copy settings. But I can also just select the image that I want to copy everything to, right-click under develop settings, sync settings. And I can just go ahead and select everything and synchronize. And now these two, for the most part, even though they were shot at different times, should match. Since this is the exposure for the water, let's also just be safe and pull the highlights back a half a stop. We don't really care about the sky. It's just this area right here. I'm going to select both of these, right-click, export with previous to get them into Photoshop. We'll go ahead and use unique names. Go up to this one first, copy, select all, copy, close, and paste it right on top there. Select this one, same thing, and paste. So now what we have, original raw, adjusted raw, and soft water. So let's take a look. Let's zoom in and see those differences that I was talking about. So this is the soft water layer. If I turn that off, you can see that I get a lot more detail and kind of looks like it moved, right? Definitely looks like it moved. So that's going to have to be addressed as well. But you can definitely see all of this detail, and then you can also see that this is losing a lot of detail. So all of those little tiny details here, especially in the trees, different things like that, by shooting at a higher f-stop, f22, and of course something past that, because this camera can go past that, you're going to continue to deteriorate the quality. So you definitely want to keep your camera right around f8 or f11 for maximum quality. That's why I always decide to do this in 2 different passes. But bigger problem is that shift. So it didn't shift here, you can see from there to there, but from here to here. So these exposures were not that far apart, but it was so windy that my camera was vibrating. There was no doubt in my mind that things were going to shift a little bit, even if it was 1 pixel. Let's go ahead and select them all, go up to Edit, and let's auto align those layers to make it easy for ourselves. Auto, none of these things checked, and we'll say OK. Now if we go here and toggle this on and off, perfectly a line. That's great. Let's go ahead and zoom this out and talk about what we're going to do. Well, obviously, we just want to use the water, so let's go ahead and sort of either mask it or paint it in. In this case, I'm just going to create a mask and paint out the areas that I don't want. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab a marquee selection just like this, and I'm just going to black it out with Option Delete. So we're not going to use that portion. And now what I'm going to do is just sort of brush around. I'm going to hit the backslash key on the keyboard, and that's going to bring up Rubylith mode. So basically here I know this part's masked out, and I'm just going to go ahead and paint the rest of it out. So obviously it's the same exact thing if you want to paint it out or paint it in, but in this case I just want all of this. First of all, just all of this to be gone so we can deal with just the water. The other thing here is I can go ahead and soften this out, this edge. I can either do that or I can go up to my mask settings and just set a little bit of a feather on that. Really not that big of a deal. Either way, we can actually clean it up. Remember, it does change a little bit, but anytime we're putting something that's exactly the same over top, the masking just has to be soft. It doesn't actually have to be perfect. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at that result. Not too bad, but let's talk about it a little bit. This is really soft, and if I turn this layer off, you can see that I get a lot more detail, especially back here. We can take a look at this. See all of this rippling water? It's not just rippling water though, it's color. So this softens it out, which looks really nice, but I lose all of the texture. So what I actually want to do is after I set the main mask, what I can do is actually go in and with a paintbrush set to a very low flow, I'll back that up just a little bit, let's say 10%, I can actually mask some of this out. So if I start to mask some of this out, you can see I'll get some of the texture underneath. It's similar to if I turn it on and off, if I just start to mask some of it out here, I can actually bring some of the texture. So sometimes I don't want to have all of the soft water in because I think it was a little bit more powerful when it had a little bit of texture behind it. This, again, complete style choice, and this is definitely artistic freedom. So you can also go the other route and just fade it with opacity. So we could say, you know what, I think that I only want it to be about 80% soft, and I want to leave that texture uniformly underneath. But in this case, I'm actually just going to paint it out as I wish and as I see fit. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a little bit more here, a little bit more here, just so it breaks up the monotony of just the soft white and paints a little bit more texture in that water. Same thing here, but in reverse. If I zoom in a little bit, remember how I said that rock was just softer with the soft water? We can really see that effect. I'm losing a lot of the details. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to remove some of the mask. So I'm going to hit the backslash key again, and I'm actually just going to paint this out a little bit. Not going to be super precise. I'm just going to paint out what's easy, what's right in front of me basically. That way, at least on the front of these rocks or the top, everything that's kind of close to the viewer will be as sharp as possible. And I love sharp details. If you spend all that time getting everything in focus, in some cases focus stacking, there's nothing worse than ruining it by shooting at less than optimum settings. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. If you want, use a harder edge brush, get really precise. And it's going to be up to you how much time you want to spend on this. Let's examine this, for example. Like these rocks, before and after, there's a lot of detail there. So I'm kind of losing that detail. So the question is, how much time do you want to spend bringing some of this detail back? My answer is, I'll spend all day doing this, but for this tutorial, I just want to show you guys how to do it. And then when you circle back to doing your own portfolio work, you'll know. And you also have to kind of gauge, at this point, who's going to see this detail? You're going to see it, obviously, because you know about it, but is anybody really going to look at these rocks? The other thing you have to consider is these rocks are mostly getting water on them, so they're a little bit wet. So when I actually toggle this on and off, you can see the soft water around it. That's causing some of this softness, but not all of it. Most importantly, we want to make sure that we're not destroying important details. And if I go back to here, you can see as I turn this on and off and actually toggle the mask on and off, we do lose some of the detail in the rock. So we've brought that back and at least given it a little bit more life. All right, so far so good, but we have some issues in the sky. Now, mainly that issue is the specular highlights on the clouds. I tested this before I selected the exposures to bring in with the lesson files themselves, and I found that even a more underexposed scene, since it was backlit, still had these highlight problems in the sky. So the sky was just too bright on these little places. So rather than being able to fix it in the raw file, you can see it here, we're going to use a different method. I'm going to create a new layer. We're going to call this Sky Cleanup. And what I'm going to use is the paintbrush tool. And I'm going to select a small and soft brush, and I'm going to pick a flow. This is going to seem ridiculous, but like 2%, because I just want to paint lightly. And if I press the Option key on the keyboard and click and roll through the image, I can actually select any color that's in the palette, from the mountain to the sky to the clouds. So I'd actually take this dark color and I could start painting it over the sky. Well, obviously that looks horrible, so we're not going to do it that way. But what I can do is start to pull some of these nice highlights, like this color here, and I can start painting right over top of these highlights. And I can just keep sampling colors so that I can paint in different and more diffuse specular highlights and fix any of these problems that we have blown out. The nice thing is, too, is I'm picking all the colors that aren't blown out. Something right around here, this soft color, and I can just paint right over top. The other nice thing about doing it this way is, since it's the colors surrounding what I'm trying to replace, kind of can get away with a lot. As long as it's soft, as long as it's a similar color, it's just a cloud. And clouds are sometimes the easiest thing because they're completely abstract. Patterns change. Unless it looks really bad, or you start painting some of the mountain into the cloud, you can definitely fix this really quickly. Well, this is not the only way to do this. And if you want to do it a different way, you can actually use the clone stamp, and you can use a flow, maybe about 10% too. But you can take some of the cloud from one area and start to sort of put it over the other. So this is the other way to sort of do that. I could take this portion, and I could just bring that color or that texture. Or if I wanted to get rid of something like this altogether, I could actually just pull one piece and just quickly sort of put that over. So that's the other way to do it. So in this case, we just kind of have to seek out and destroy. In this one here, for example, I'm actually going to use the brush tool again, and I'm going to pick, let's say, let's bring some of these pinker tones back in like this, and we'll just go ahead and paint that, soften it out. So you see how quickly it softens out those highlights. And I see another one off to the right, but before I do that, I want to add some more color back into that. Perfect. Follow up as well with a little bit of this texture from the cloud. I'll do that with the clone stamp. Add a little bit of texture from it. And here, same thing. Use the clone stamp, smaller brush. This part of the cloud looks fine, and we'll just sort of fix that. Follow up with the paintbrush tool, so just B on the keyboard, and we'll pick some of those tones that look a little bit nice and soft. Perfect. So anytime you run into this situation, anytime that you have highlights that are just obnoxious or blown out or just don't fit, just fix them this way. You can just go ahead and paint them into a more harmonious color. And we'll zoom out a little bit just to see if there's anything else here. Do a quick before and after. You can see that those highlights are gone. They look pretty good. This one's a little bit blown out. Let's go ahead and take some of this color, and we'll just put that color right over top. Over here, this might be a little suspect, really easy to get rid of. Same thing, we'll just bring that softer color in so it looks more natural. Let's just go ahead and scroll around. It's always better to do this before you get into the heavier color grading. That way you don't have to clean up work when new layers are made. Just like object removal, object cleanup, adjustment, corrections, all those should be done as early in production as possible. And sometimes, believe it or not, this is easier than trying to do any kind of blending if we wanted to use one layer for the sky and one for the bottom, because we don't have to match them or worry about anything, and this is so close already. And you can see how much detail is still in this background. It looks really nice. All right, so I think that takes care of the sky cleanup. Now let's go ahead and use Shift Option Command E, create a new layer, let me use the Adobe Camera Raw filter, ACRF. Let me just bring the exposure up a little bit. I feel it's too underexposed. Let's bring it up 1/4 of a stop. So 0.25. Let's compensate the highlights by pulling them back a little bit to not destroy that area that we work so hard to preserve. Let's bring some vibrance back in. Just a little. I feel like this is too cold, but if I warm it up, I don't want to go too far because we have this nice blue tone. So maybe just a little tiny bit. Something ridiculously minor, like 3 or 4%, just to make that warmer adjustment overall. Let's go back to the sky here. Select my mountains and my sky. Let's reset this, and I think what I'm actually going to do is -25 on the highlights to pull those down, pull the shadows up a little bit, the same, and I think I'm going to add some saturation to the sky. Just a little bit can go a long way. Let's go ahead and apply that. Now, taking a look at the result, this is really kind of annoying too. These highlights are so close to blown out, and I corrected them by painting them down, that I'm pushing them too far again. So rather than go back into Adobe Camera Raw, since these are really sensitive highlights, there's another way that we can apply this correction, and it's a minor correction, while preserving the highlights and keeping them intact. And we're going to do that by creating some channels that we can use for masking. Now, this is going to be basic luminosity masking again, and by this point in the tutorial, we've created a lot of luminosity masks. We even, if you remember, already created our own action called Create Luminosity Masks. So I'm going to use that action again. I'm going to hit play, and that's going to create 3 highlights, shadows, and midtones. And what I'm actually going to use this time is shadows, because I want to use this as a mask to protect those highlights. So I'm going to select it, re-enable RGB, and then with this Camera Raw filter, no folders, nothing like that, I'm just going to create a new mask and apply this as a mask. So now it's going to color correct everything we did in Adobe Camera Raw, only exists inside the shadows and doesn't exist inside of these highlights areas, especially here in the water, and definitely you see how hot these highlights were. Those are almost black on the mask there. So you can see that that kind of works. Now if you shift click this, you'll be able to see the before and after. Now, I think that the landscape benefits from some of this correction and not all of it. Same thing with the sky. I think it's just too intense. So what I'm going to do is roll it back a little bit. Here in the mask settings or the properties, I can actually change the density, take it all the way down, and you can see that the mask disappears. So I can choose 100% density, 0%, or somewhere in between. And I'm just going to roll this up until the highlights are protected, but everything else looks good as well. And that looks like right around 80%. This is kind of the best of both worlds. So I'm being able to correct some of the landscape, and you can see it's not as dramatic when I do this, and protect it. So this mask is now, if we take a look at it, only 80% opaque. So it softens that effect a little bit and softens the amount of masking it did around these highlights. This scene is already really beautiful. We can go in and make some minor adjustments, obviously, but what I really want to focus on for this lesson is color separation. Now we have a lot of different tones here, and what I really want to do is separate those tones and give them life. Specifically, that's going to be the fall colors, the variation of those tones, and also the water and mountains themselves. Now the way that I'm going to do that is with a series of adjustment layers and different masks, and we're going to paint those masks in. Let's start with the fall colors. Specifically, let's start with those warm tones. Here, I'm going to go ahead and create a photo filter. By default, it's set to warming filter. Let's turn that up to 50%. Let's see what happens. All right, that's pretty nice. Let's see if we change this to the warming filter 81. It's even more intense. So if I toggle this on and off, you can see that it's really warming up these tones, but of course it's warming up the whole image. So let's go ahead and black this mask out by Option Delete on the keyboard, flood with my background color, and now with the brush tool, let's pick a flow of maybe 20%, And I'm going to brush all this in manually. Now right around this color here, I'm just going to start to brush this in. You can see it instantly start to warm up. And I'm going to find all of these warm tones here, and I'm going to turn that down to 10% so that I can soften this just a little bit. I'm just going to start to paint in. We'll go somewhere in between 15%, and I really just want to find all of these warm tones. So anything that was already starting to turn into a fall color around the green, I just want to pick that up. And you can see if I turn this on and off, we're already starting to get that effect. So now, it's all about, it's kind of like paint by numbers actually. Let's pretend this is a paint by number project. This also, again, sort of borderlines more of an artistic process. Obviously we want these colors to pop, but how much do we want them to pop? How detailed do we want to be? And is it worth actually going through and painting just the colors individually, or could we just warming filter everything even around the greens? Well, if we really zoom in on some of this, like these little details, these little moss-covered, I think they're rocks, you can see that as I start to paint this in, it really starts to separate them from the green. The nice thing is you can still warm up green tones and they just turn a little bit yellow. Toggle this on and off again. You can see it's subtle, but we're actually starting to get some more pop and variation out of the fall colors. Follow down here near the water. And we'll just keep going across. Let's get some of this. That looks pretty nice. I don't really want to work on the background so much. I just want this to be in the foreground. Now here is a really good example that we can actually just get most of this with a larger brush, because this is kind of mostly yellow and orange with just a little bit of green. In a moment we'll follow up with some other colors as well. Let's go ahead and take care of all of this. Well, this is something that I'll really start to focus on, especially when I like an image a lot, and I really do like this image. I feel like it's one of the better shots from Photographing the World 4, and it also gives us the opportunity to start giving this color back, because it was the peak of fall colors, but depending on the shooting situation, depending on the lighting, it's very backlit, we're actually not seeing them at their peak. You can also see there's still a lot of green here, so they haven't fully turned. And to be honest, you see all these little trees? There was a fire in the park here, and it burnt a lot of those trees. So if you've seen any shots of all the burnt trees and looking through the trees at the spires, they're all over the place. So before the fire, I'm sure those trees were absolutely beautiful. But now, everything that's actually turning is all this like lowland moss and grass and different things like that, where you can see these trees are just sort of burnt out. So I like those trees. Can leave them in sharp contrast, but we'll go ahead and paint in some of this. We just back it up just a little bit and we'll take a look at what we've done so far. So most people wouldn't notice it. We notice it because we're trying to get the best out of our work. So we're going to go ahead and name this Warming Colors. Now, I can also start to address some of this stuff down here. So we can mitigate some of this color later using hue saturation to get rid of some of the blue. But what I can also do is start to fix some of these cool tones in the rocks by doing the same thing, by painting in some of these warm tones. And it looks pretty nice. Similar fashion here. Let's go ahead and fix some of the tonality here so it's not so cold. I think it should look a little bit more warm, so we'll fix the colors in those rocks. And we can start to bring some of the color back into the rocks as well. And if this seems like a lot of work, well, it is. But it's your work, and you should spend as much time as it takes to get it exactly like you want it. Here, for example, down here, these little areas would look pretty nice if they were a little warmer, in my opinion. This area here, some of these little rocks. In fact, I'm not exactly sure what type of rock it is, but it has a lot of color variation already. You can see here some of that. We can just start to really play on some of that variation in tonality. And let's fix that little cool tone there, replace it with a warm tone. Let's pick some of this up down here on the beach, if you can call that a beach, a rocky beach. Some of this here, warm some of that up. these rocks. Let's go ahead and add some there. Just a little bit. Just a little bit of specular warmth along here. I think this looks really nice, painting in some of the warmth around this moss on the rocks. If we share this on Facebook or Instagram, I think you can kind of tell that it's a little bit warmer, but if you were to print this really large, you really have to be zoomed in to see this level of detail that we're putting into it. But it's worth doing even if you're not planning on sharing this large. I always think this is kind of fun to redistribute some of the tonality and colors. Warm tones look good. Let's go ahead and follow up with another photo filter, and let's go with just green. And let's increase that just a little bit. And you can see it's pretty obnoxious right now. Everything's green. That's not what we want. So let's go ahead and black that out. We'll call this green colors. And we'll just go ahead and reset that as well. Now this is actually kind of fun. This will separate the yellow from the green. So this can be really powerful. And I'll zoom in a little bit more so you can see. If I start painting over that, you can see that it's going to get rid of the yellow. I don't want that. But if I go around some of this area of this green, I can really make this green stand out from the yellow tones. So this can become really powerful if you want to be able to isolate some of those tones. Now you're not going to paint as much green in as you would the warm tones, but it's worth painting a little bit in, especially in these areas. And you can see if I turn that on and off, it's subtle, but if you look a few times, you can actually see how it's pulling that separation. And we'll just go ahead and clean up some of these greens here. Give it a little bit more saturation. Down here, for example, you can really pull those greens out. The greens on the edge, greens on the edge, these greens here. Especially around darker areas, this can look really nice. But it is time consuming. I just want to make sure that I get everything that I want here, up here, and along here. Shoot over to the left side, zoom that out a little bit, and now we can really start to separate those tones. Put so much warmth on this side, and now I can start to pull the greens in too. Make it feel like it's really varied in tonality. Also have a feeling if we scroll down a little bit and we zoom in, we also have some green here on the moss. Some of the mossy green tones we can actually add back into here. Here in the water, along the rocks. Here in the water, actually, we can start to add some of the green tones back. Maybe that's a little bit too much. Let's just go ahead and remove what we did there. We'll address that a little bit later. There's some moss down here. Really delicate, but we'll go ahead and add a little bit back in here around those mossy areas just to pick up that detail. It's there, might as well use it. That looks pretty good. Zoom out a few steps. At this point, I've got most of the fall colors, but let's say there were other tones, like red or maple. Maple turns red, it's really beautiful. I could actually go up here and do the same thing, and I could pick something like deep red, and we could just call this red colors. Now right now, you can see it kind of adds a magenta cast to everything, which is okay, but in certain areas it can be interesting. So let's go ahead and black this out as well. If I zoom in, right now everything's mostly yellow. But if I add a little bit of red, and there actually are some red tones here, if I add some red around the edges, it could look pretty nice. So let's just go ahead and increase the reds. But it'll also turn the yellows into a more golden color. So we can start to transform some of these yellow tones into more golden colors. And that's, again, a little bit more artistic. But if we had more of the red color variation here, we could add a lot more. So whatever colors you want to accentuate, whatever colors you have in the fall, you can start to do it this way. And it works really well. So we can just go ahead and take all these, drag them to the folder, and we'll call this Fall Colors. Enhance. Now let's talk about blue. Blue in the water looks great. We have a little bit of blue in the foreground, a little bit of blue picked up in the trees. Lots of blue back here on the mountains and in the snow. So let's go ahead and mitigate that blue tone. So let's create a hue saturation layer now. I'll select the blues, and what I'm going to do is just turn this down all the way. And you can see, obviously I'm not going to use this effect, but that's the blue in the sky, blue in the mountains. But you see I've not selected the blue in the water because it's more cyan. So if I do this, I can actually just change it until it selects all the blue tones. I want to make sure I get everything. And I won't go that dramatic. I actually probably will go about 50. And I'll just toggle this on and off. Take a look at the mountain, take a look at everything else around it. That actually looks just right. So let's call this blue subtract. Black that mask out, and let's go ahead and zoom in and start painting some of it out. Now I can use the brush, maybe a flow of about 30, and even in these areas here in the trees, I can pull some of the blue out of those trees, make them a little bit more clean. Down here on the beach, I can pull some of the blue out. Now I already cleaned that up by using a warming filter, but just in case we missed some, there might still be some there. You can see it's light, but it's still there. Just want to find any areas that we're getting any of that bounce light or that blue light. Most importantly, I want to go up here to the mountain and I want to remove it here. So I'm going to go ahead and pick flow of 50%, and I'm going to remove the blue in the base of the mountain. Nice thing is this going to remove the blue cast, but it's not going to remove any of the color. So we just have the blue cast, but all of the fall colors in the background are still intact. Same thing here. I want to remove it from the ice, but I should probably point out there's a glacier up here. Very beautiful glacier. So I don't want to remove it around the glacier. Just along the bottom, I don't want to pull the color out of the glacier. That's actually pretty beautiful. I'll zoom out just a little bit here. Let's scroll over. Make sure we get all of this. Here too, I'm a little concerned. I want this area, the bottom of these mountains. Now, these mountains are made out of different materials altogether, different types of rocks. You can see the stacks, dark, light, dark. So what I'm actually going to do is just take the blue out of the middle lighter, warmer stack, but leave it at the tops of those mountains. I think they look amazing, actually. You can see it's incredible variation in the tonality of this mountain. But I just want to go in and clean all of this up. So all of the blue out of the warm tones. But I want to be careful in these other areas to leave it, some of it at least. Here too, let's go ahead and clean up that snow. You can see here. So the problem is if I take all of this out, I don't want it to be black. So I have to be really careful about this. That's why I've left the blue tones in there. So with something like this, I kind of have to be really careful with a light brush if I just want to remove a little bit here from the snow, just so it's not as intense. It's also covered with the cloud, so I want to be a little careful about that. Take a look at this before and after. Just basically making sure that I didn't miss anything. That doesn't look like I did. Looks like I got everything here. Check here, before and after, missed a little bit. Missed a little bit there. And let's go ahead and take a look. That looks good. So we have the colors, we have the variation in the mountains. Now let's mess with the color of the water itself. Let's do that with a hue saturation layer. This time I'm going to do the same kind of selection. So let's say blues, and I'll double check just by selecting everything. All right, so I have everything selected. We'll go ahead and set this back to 0. And what I can actually do now is a hue shift. So I can either make it a little bit more blue or a little bit more cyan. And I think that the cyan color, because that's the more natural color it is in the environment, looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and hue shift the blue so we get a nice cyan. Let's bring the saturation up just a little bit. And this is kind of cool too. If I pull the lightness down, if I pull it up, you can see it's going to remove saturation. But I have this tiny little threshold where I can make it a little lighter or a little bit darker. So I'm going to make it a little bit darker. I'm just going to match all these settings too. So we have -10, +10, and -10. What's cool about this is there's really nothing else left blue in the scene. So I'm not shifting any colors except for the sky and the water. So this is really easy. What I can actually do is just draw a mask around the area that I want to change. In this case, it's all this. And I can delete this mask that came with it and just apply a new one. And now I have that hue shift on that layer, which is really nice. We're going to call this watercolor shift. Now let's go ahead and create a dodge and burn layer. So option click, and we'll call this dodge burn. Well, dodge/burn. And we'll set it to overlay, fill with neutral, just like this. Now, I'm not going to dodge and burn the landscape, but what I want to do is actually burn some of this detail back into the water. So I love all of this detail, all of these cyan colors and the white. Let's go ahead and do something like 0.2 on the flow because it can be really dramatic. I'm going to hit D on the keyboard and that's going to reset my palette. I'm going to hit X and that's going to swap it to white. And if I hit X again, it's going to swap it to black. So right now, I want to burn some of this detail. So if I start to do this, you can see that I can get my detail back, more detail here in the water. So this is where it gets really fun. We can actually enhance these little tendrils of water using the burn technique. And again, this is one of those artistic, really fine-tuning this image kind of situation. So it's fun, but you have to decide how much you want to do. You have to decide how much should you do. Like in this area back here, that's already nice, too dark already because it's over the rock. But if I go here, if I start to pull these up, then we're going to start to see those highlights. Because when we dodge and burn, it's not really going to affect the highlights, and most of this is highlights. So if I start to just burn over top of some of this, it's going to pull out the detail. This here, beautiful detail. This here also, we can actually do more of a wide sort of burning here. So see how I can pull all those detail? And it's actually getting that contrast to be so, so nice. So let's just go ahead and do some more of that. Here too. Definitely start to pull those out. Almost like these are little sculpted cells of water. This can be really nice. Really fun to do too. You can start to really take advantage of that. When we burn it, you can see that you get these tendrils back. So see these little tendrils here that I'm creating, tendrils of water, details of water. Let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit. Here too, you can do that a little bit more down here. These tendrils here. It's just a really nice effect. All of this just like that. We take this before and after, on and off, you can see the difference. Next step, let's go ahead and dodge some details. Of course that's logical. Of course that's the next thing we were going to do. Where I really want to dodge these details is around the water itself. So I'm going to go back actually to burn, and you can see that I can start to pull these areas down. So what I'm doing is creating more variation in the little tendrils of water. But if I dodge instead, I have to be really careful because I'll start to blow these values out. So I don't want to do too much around the water, maybe just a little bit if I really see the opportunity for detail. What I want to do is start bringing up the highlights on these mossy rocks because they look really nice. So this should be picking up some more highlights, and that's exactly what I'm going to do here. Just kind of go around here, chisel out some of the details so that we can really see it. Here, I might want to lighten that up a little bit. And even here, I can lighten some of this up just a little bit. Around these rocks, though, that's where it starts to look really nice. After I finish those, maybe this guy here, why not? Let's go down here and zoom it out a little bit. We don't need to be that close. Same thing here. Let's go ahead and bring up some of these highlights. These are really dark stones as they are naturally, but we can actually increase the highlights. And this way, also increase the contrast at the same time. So giving it a little bit more life and variation. In the foreground here, I like to do this too because it's going to create the reverse of a vignette effect. So this rock is kind of like a big vignette on the lower right side. So I'm just going to brighten a lot of these details up. Just give it a little bit more life, make it a little bit more interesting, and you can see what that looks like there. We'll dodge a little bit more. Again, this is a very artistic process, and I like to say individual results may vary. Actually, will always vary. Let's go right around here to the bottom of this. Pull some of that moss color up, some of that moss on the bottom of these rocks. See if we can give more attention to it. Let's double check this, turn this off and on. That looks pretty good, but let's go ahead and broaden this effect with a larger brush. That looks good. Now, we have to just go in and decide if there's any fine tuning that we want. Burn, burn, burn. Burn, burn, burn. Maybe we want to dodge these little areas here. A little dodge here, dodge there, dodge here, burn there. Really never ends. You can spend a long time doing this. I think that all looks great. That all looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we've done. Yeah, it's right on track. This is really pulling that detail out nicely. All right, last thing I want to do is change the overall brightness of this image. You can see I've done so much work trying to protect the highlights that I'm missing a lot of specular data right here. So let's go back to the channels, and I'm going to use the shadows again to preserve the highlights. Select it, Command click. I'm going to go up here. Let's create a folder called Shadows. And I'll create a mask and apply it. Now let's create a curves layer. And you can see that big gap here. I can just go ahead and pull this in until I sort of touch that edge. And the nice thing is, highlights are mostly protected. I can't go too far because I'm going to get the surrounding highlights. But let's just go ahead and pull this up just a little bit, something just like that. Now, if we want to add a little bit of contrast, we can use our midtones channel here. Command click that to select it. And we can also create a midtones mask, curves. And what I'm actually going to do is leave this curves, this midtones, we'll call this midtones. We'll call this global bright. This midtones is going to stay inside of the shadows. So no matter what I do here, it's not going to affect those highlights because we have to protect those highlights. So here I can go ahead and add my contrast, my final contrast. I can pull up the highlights around it, so the midtones around that too, and I can get a nice result without having to worry about this. If this was out here, yep, you can see the difference between here being outside of it and inside of the shadows. So we can do a multi-luminosity masked color correction. I'm not going to try to say that again. That sounded pretty good. So here we have the shadows are protected, and we have a midtones mask in there. So obviously this masks this, so it's a nested mask, but it's pretty powerful. So we can actually go a little bit more crazy on the midtones and not worry about destroying the highlights. Well, I don't want to darken it too much. I actually just want to bring the values up. Between these two, we just need to find the balance. Can't go too far here, but we definitely want to bring it up to about there. Here we can compensate. Maybe we don't darken it that much. Maybe we brighten it up just a little bit more around the midtones. And that's actually bringing the water up a little bit. Yeah, that's looking pretty nice. And cleaning up the clouds, making them look a little less dark in the sky. I like the way that looks. All right, let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit. And let's go ahead and take a look at everything that we've done. So straight out of camera, we had a single exposure. We started with the original raw. Straight out of camera, we adjusted things in Lightroom, went from here to here. Next thing we did is we adjusted the water by bringing in an additional exposure for the soft water. Then we cleaned up those specular highlights in the sky, unified it with a camera raw filter by brightening everything, and then we enhanced the fall colors. and I know that's hard to see globally, but we saw it zoomed in. Then we did some more color correction and some dodging and burning, and we ended up with this. So at the beginning, straight out of camera, we were here, and then we took it all the way to here. The only thing I do want to point out is we would have to go in and crop this, because remember, it did shift 1 pixel, so there's going to be a little tiny 1 pixel edge. So anytime that you align layers, make sure before you do your final that you get rid of that. It's very minor here. I just wanted to point it out, just in case you guys noticed that with PSD that is provided in the lesson files. I just didn't crop this, but I am well aware that it's there. So once again, from here to here. I think that came out great. So that wraps everything up in the studio today. Next time I see you guys, we'll be exploring more of Patagonia.